Good morning and welcome to Learn Extra Lessons for Grade 11. Today we're going to look at our final topic on development, which is development issues and challenges, as well as the role of aid in terms of development. So we're going to look through a whole lot of key concepts, we're going to do some definitions, explaining different important concepts, and then finally we will look at some questions and how to answer them. So if we look at our key concepts, in this particular section, we're going to be looking at the importance of including women in all development projects across the world. And that's primarily because in the past, women have been unequal to men in society, and it is now becoming essentially important to develop these women, especially in developing countries. We're going to look at how development is having an effect on the environment, what kind of issues it's causing, what are the long-term consequences of these issues, and how we can manage our development in a sustainable manner so that it does not have an impact on the environment. We're going to look at the role that our state and businesses play within development, especially within South Africa. And finally, we're going to view the different types of aid and how they are going to affect development across the countryside as well. All right. So in terms of our terminology, those are our important definitions. These are the ones that are specific to this topic, and we're going to look at them one by one. Our first definition is what is meant by the term gender. And I think it's quite an important one, especially when we're going to look at the role that females have in terms of development. And if we just look at the screen, it says, gender refers to either being male or female and the way in which a society or a culture treats the individual men and women differently. And so this is going to be quite important for our first section on the role women play in development. Our Gender Inequality Index, or what's abbreviated to the GII, is referring to, it's a United Nations index, okay? And what they've done, it's an index to show the degree of equality or inequality that exists between men and women within a country. And what we'll generally find here at grade 11s is that the equality in a developed country is far greater than the equality within developing nations. We're going to look at the informal sector, and the reason we're looking at the informal sector is because the majority of women in society are working within the informal sector in most developing countries. And what it says as part of the definition is the informal sector refers to any person that is self-employed, okay? These people generally trade goods on the streets, or they work from their home backyards or from their garages in their houses. They're not part of the formal economic sector, which makes much sense since we are defining the informal sector. They have no fixed contracts. Their hours are not fixed, so they don't work between 8 and 5. And most importantly, when you are a part of the informal sector, you are not paying taxes to the country that you live in. Permaculture is quite an interesting one. Okay, we haven't heard this word often. And what permaculture refers to is basically, it's the type of agriculture that meets people's needs in a sustainable manner. So it is a sustainable agricultural form of activity, and that's why it's quite important when obviously we're looking at how development is impacting the environment. An environmental impact assessment, these are becoming essentially of great importance, especially in South Africa. Any new development project that gets underway, you need an environmental impact assessment. So exactly what it is the environmental impact assessment is a study that is conducted by people who are qualified to do so, and they need to assess the impact on the environment that a specific development project would have on that environment. So, for example, if we want to build a new hotel, then where that hotel is going to be built, an environmental impact assessment will be conducted in order to prove, all right, that is the best site for a proposed hotel. It has little damage to the environment. We can introduce more environmental species, that kind of idea. Okay. Carbon emissions is quite an easy one, okay? Our carbon emissions essentially refers to gases like carbon dioxide that are polluting the atmosphere. And any sort of gas that is causing pollution or harm to our atmosphere is going to be very important in the degradation of our environment. Our carbon footprint is an interesting one, okay? And all of us, whether you are 5 years old, whether you are 50 years old, are leaving some or other carbon footprint on the Earth's atmosphere. On the Earth's surface. So our carbon footprint is referring to the quantity of carbon gases that each person contributes to the pollution of the atmosphere through his or her daily activities. So an example for that would be my carbon footprint would be driving here today in my car, the toxic gases that are released from the engine of my car. This morning I would have eaten breakfast. That breakfast was produced in a factory. That factory would have released carbon emissions. So everything we do on a daily basis is adding to man's carbon footprint, and every single person is responsible for their own carbon footprint. When we refer to a green economy, okay, we are referring to an economy that does no damage to the environment at all, okay? So it's working with the environment, it's in a sustainable manner, development is taking place, we are not harming anything as a result of the development that takes place. Food security is an interesting one. I've been marking papers and things where students have written that food security is when the food in a country is protected by a security company. And obviously that's just a funny sort of comical thing. But the true definition of food security is when people in a country at all times have access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that will help them to maintain a healthy lifestyle. So as long as a country has sufficient quantity of food for their entire population plus reserves, we can say that the country is food secure. Obviously, a lot of our developing countries undergo food insecurity, where the amount of food and that available to their people is limited, and therefore they actually battle in terms of providing a healthy lifestyle for their nation. Agro-processing, okay, refers to industries that produce predominantly agricultural products. So something like Koo manufacturing plant could be considered an agro-processing plant because it takes the raw materials from farming and agriculture and turns them into canned goods, which are then sold on our shelves. Beneficiation, okay, it's a long word. It's a bit of a mouthful, but the understanding of it is actually quite easy. What it implies is basically to treat and use minerals so that the benefits stay in the home country as opposed to exporting the mineral and then importing it back into the country. So what, in a nutshell, beneficiation is about is we need to manufacture and process our own raw materials before sending them out of our country. Because if we export raw materials that have been, or no processing or manufacturing has happened, the amount of export finance that we get for those is very limited. So if we process and manufacture goods within our own country and then export them off our shores, we get a much better export financial gain from those, and our economy starts to develop. In terms of talking about aid, okay, very important is basically when we refer to aid giving of a country, it's any assistance or help that is given by one country or an organization, okay, to another country. So examples of aid can include the giving of food, the provision of medicines, palming off some money to developing countries, or the use of technology and sending that technology over to other countries. So aid is quite an important thing, and one of the topics that we're going to discuss today is the different types of aid that exists between different countries. Developmental aid is obviously more relevant to the topic of development that we are studying, and it's just basically a very similar definition to aid, which we've looked at, but it's money, knowledge, or skills that are donated, especially to developing countries, in order to assist their economies, their social conditions, their political, as well as any environmental development within that country. So developmental aid is all about giving from the developed countries to the developing countries in order for those developing nations to improve their economies, improve the living conditions of their populations. All right, in terms of aid, we speak about donors and recipients, okay? A donor is a country or an organization that gives aid out, okay? And if it's a recipient, you're a country or an organization that is receiving aid. So donor gives it out, recipient receives the aid from a donor country. All right. Those are our most important definitions for this topic on development issues and the role of aid in development. We're now going to start with the explanation of what is important and what we need to be looking at. So the first thing that we're going to explain and look at is how the role of women in development is starting to grow within the worldwide economy. And it's particularly important, grade 11s, when we look at this, we are predominantly referring to the developing nations and how women there are unequal a lot of the time to the role that the men have in those countries. So it says here, men and women do different things within society, okay? Traditionally speaking, men have been responsible for bringing home the income. That's their main role, okay? And women are responsible for raising the children, for cooking the dinner, for making sure that the home runs effectively. And those have been the traditional ideas that were in place, say, 100 years ago. Unfortunately, though, society is changing and women are becoming more empowered, and therefore these roles are starting to change. And in some homes now you find that it's actually the lady who goes out and works and the husband who stays home and cooks and cleans and looks after the children. We call these different things gender roles, okay? So we've just spoken about that. What has been the typical ideas of gender roles and what are the more modern ideas according to gender roles? The roles are based on tradition, okay, culture, or religious belief. So depending on where your focus lies and what your culture, tradition, and religious beliefs are is going to depend on how these roles are dished out within a certain family. In many parts of the world, the differences between gender roles is vast. So in other words, different countries have got huge inequality between the role of men and the role of women. Since people are the focal area of development, there needs to be equality in all aspects between genders for meaningful development to occur. So what they're trying to say here is that for generous development to take place, women need to have equality with men, and those roles are starting to change. All right. Gender issues are related to the following. So in other words, why have these past traditions stuck onto what was 100 years ago the right thing to do? So it says, attitudes, okay? Women are predominantly seen as caregivers and homemakers. That's what I said the tradition was 100 years ago. In many cultures, women are seen as belonging first to their fathers. So you're almost like a property of your dad, something that he could hold on to. And once you were passed over for marriage, you became the responsibility of your husband. Women are not encouraged to have an opinion or seek an education, and the problem that's been around in the past is many women are very happy to accept this role and not want to better their life or get an education or even speak up in terms of what their opinions are meant to be. So attitudes to the role of women is very, very set in its ways. Access to resources, okay? Traditionally, women have very little access to resources. Those resources could include things like education, property, employment. a lot of the time in particular countries, girls are not allowed to go to school. They're meant to stay at home with their mothers, learn how to cook, learn how to bake, learn how to clean the house. Women are not given the right to own any property within a country. They're not encouraged to go and get employment. And if they are encouraged to become employed, they need to stick to traditional woman jobs of being employed in nursing or teaching. Okay? So this is a big problem in terms of development and empowering women to be equal to men. Developed countries now offer equal education. So the mindset has somewhat changed, all right? But those developing countries still have more men involved in science and engineering. And very few women take up those careers because they're not encouraged to do so. Meanwhile, in developing countries, education of boys is still the top priority in those countries, and they haven't had this mindset change that we need to empower women. In many developing countries, women are still not able to own land, and therefore they're predominantly involved in subsistence agriculture. It is the responsibility of the woman to work on the fields, to plow the land, to harvest the crops, and that is why they're referring to the women here being involved in subsistence agriculture. When they do find employment outside of agriculture, they find the lowest paying jobs, or that's pretty much what they can achieve, and they work in the informal sector. So when you're in the informal sector, you have very bad working conditions, your salaries are low, they're not guaranteed. Okay, so one day you might have a good day, the next day is a bad day, and this is still the challenge in our developing countries, is to equate women with men, encourage them to become educated, get a further education, sort of a university degree, and go out and find an actual job within the formal sector. Power is another problem, okay, with regard to the empowering of women. It says in developing countries, women are not involved in any decision-making processes. Their thoughts and their questions are not even taken into account. It's kind of like, well, your opinion doesn't count. This is the decision we are going to make. Many laws do exist, okay, to prevent discrimination, but they're seldom upheld by governments. And in countries like India and that, the woman still remains the property of her father. She's then passed off to marriage. And once she's married her husband, she then has to move in with her in-laws. Okay, so taken totally away from her own family, and now pretty much works for this family because that's what she's been destined to do. Okay, and in India, if you try and follow a career in education and that, or try and get a university degree, it is actually still very, very difficult. Some societies do offer women equal rights, okay, but still suffer many forms of discrimination. So they, on paper, they're given these equal rights, but a lot of the time, women are exposed to sexual abuse and violence in the communities in which they are staying. Okay. In terms of measuring how equal women are to men, the United Nations came up with what's called the Gender Inequality Index, or the GII. And what this index does, grade 11s, is it indicates the degree of equality or inequality that exists between men and women within a certain country. The following factors are taken into account for the United Nations to draw up this index. Things like the health, okay, of the girls and the women, political representation, in other words, how many women are dealing within the politics of the country, the education levels of those women, and the job opportunities that those women are exposed to. So, for example, in South Africa, women are pretty equal to men. You can apply for the same job. What it comes down to is basically then based on your abilities. The way in which this equality index works is that if you get a score close to 0, okay, it indicates maximum equality amongst male and females within your country. So a score close to 0, equality, women are equal to men. A higher GII score, closer to 1, okay, and you would have seen over time that a lot of these development indexes are based from 0 to 1, means that there's maximum inequality between the men and women within the country. And just from what we know about developed and developing countries, we would expect that our GII reading, okay, in developed nations is going to be closer to 0, and our GII reading in developing countries is going to be much closer to 1. All right, so underneath just my last point, generally speaking, the MEDCs have scores close to 0, which is what I spoke about, and our LEDCs, less economically developed countries, have scores much closer to 1. All right, moving on now away from how and why we should empower women and the challenges that are facing that, we are moving on to the effect that development has on the environment in which our countries are based. So it says on the screen, development is linked to increases in industrialization and technology. That is what development is about. The more developed a country becomes, the more involved in industrial activity and the use of technology. The positive impact this brings for human beings is economic and social improvements. So if a country is industrialized and exporting more goods, the economy of that country increases, as well as the social impact, so the quality of life of its population, because there's more finances coming into that country. On the other hand, though, it's the negative impacts is that we are harming our environment, okay? And a lot of countries at the moment are not looking at how they are harming the environment at all. Some of the effects include the following, okay? We've all heard about global warming. That's the increasing temperatures across our world, whereby our ice caps and that are starting to melt, which is going to have severe problems. Deforestation. If we have deforestation taking place, grade 11s, we reduce the amount of oxygen given off. We increase the amount of carbon dioxide. And increasing carbon dioxide into a already carbon-filled atmosphere is not good for anybody. Soil erosion. We all need to eat, okay? Food is important to us. And the more soil erosion we have, the more fertile soil is lost, and it's very difficult to get that fertility back into the soil, which will decrease our food production ultimately. Water and air pollution. We all rely on access to clean drinking water. Only about 2% of all water found on Earth is fresh water. We cannot drink seawater. To desalinate the seawater is very expensive. So we've got to start looking after the things that are essential to improve our basic quality of life. Air pollution, I've already said, our atmosphere is capable of coping with a certain amount of carbon dioxide. But when it has an excess amount of carbon dioxide, our atmosphere starts to shut down. Extinction of plants and animals. We know that there are a variety of fauna and flora that already is extinct, and we can't get it back, okay? Once it's gone, it's gone. So if you just look, we've got quite a nice diagram here showing the effects on the environment. So in the center, we've got the heading impacts, okay? And it branches off from there. So we have economics, okay? We have global warming. Global warming is going to cause war. They said that World War III is not going to be fought over any political issues. It's going to be fought over the access to fresh water supplies. And as a result of what we're doing to the earth, that is a very, very real possibility. Famine, plague, global nuclear war, okay? Heat waves, oceans warming. Those are all the impacts of global warming. If we look here, we're going to experience food shortages, okay? Polar bears are going to become extinct. Because why? We as humans are getting rid of their habitat by increasing global warming. So we've got to be very careful that our development happens in a sustainable manner so that we still are going to have an earth that we can live upon. All right. The effect now of development on the environment, there's certain issues that we can look at specifically. So the two issues that we're going to look at is overconsumption and biocapacity, and how these two work hand in hand with each other. In terms of overconsumption, it says the more developed a society becomes, the more resources it's going to consume. human, okay? It's in our human nature that the more and more that we're given, the more and more that we actually want, okay? So I might only need to eat 1 chocolate bar, but I actually want to eat 5 because I can. All right, and that's what's meant by this overconsumption idea. A balance between the rate at which people use the resources and the Earth's capacity to reproduce the resources needs to be maintained. So we need to use our resources in such a manner that the Earth has time to reproduce what we are using. And some of our resources are actually not able to be replaced. Our mineral resources, once we use all our minerals, there's no minerals left in the world for us to get. So if South Africa mines every last ounce of gold, there's no more gold left within the borders of South Africa. When we refer to biocapacity, it's quite an interesting little word, okay? It is the biological ability of the Earth to reproduce resources and absorb waste generated by humans, okay? I've spoken to you before about the fact that our atmosphere can cope with certain amounts of carbon dioxide. If we exceed the additional carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, we are putting pressure on our atmosphere and it's unable to cope with those additional gases. The ecological footprint is the amount of biologically productive area humans use in order to meet its needs. At the current rate, humanity's ecological footprint is greater than the Earth's biocapacity. And there's just a cute little comic over here, okay? Man putting his foot right through the center of the Earth, literally kicking out the center, and if someone were to kick out your center, you would start to crumble from the inside as well. And I think that's what they're trying to portray with this image, is that man is severely affecting the environment. It says, the figure below confirms that resource consumption increases with the level of development. So the more developed a country becomes, the more it needs to use the resources. And what we see within this diagram is basically, if you can just look at the colors, if you might not be able to see the information given on the side, but where we have the red and the orange colors, that is where our footprint, man's ecological footprint, is far greater than the Earth's biocapacity. And what's quite interesting about this diagram is that you can see, if I were to draw in an imaginary brunt line, and if I just to remind you about the brunt line, which we've done in previous units, is the brunt line divides the world into the developed and the developing countries. So if I were to draw in the brunt line, just sort of like randomly coming through parts, okay, the brunt line would look something like that. And therefore, you can see that all these countries, okay, there's one part of Europe, Asia over here, their ecological footprint is much greater than the Earth's biocapacity. And that's going to be a very big problem in terms of what's coming in our future. All right. Now we need to look at what role do state and businesses play in the development of South Africa. So what role does the government have, and what role do major corporations and major businesses within South Africa have in taking South Africa forward in terms of development? It says the ultimate responsibility for development of a country lies with the state. So the government makes all the decisions, has all the finances. It is their job to take a country from developing towards a developed nation. Various social and economic development policies and programs are implemented in order to do this. So we look at social aspects, and we have to have a certain amount of economic development. I've stated many a time that economic development cannot take place effectively unless the people of that nation have developed appropriately as well. The government may choose its involvement in a program. Either it is completely responsible or they play a supportive role. So ultimately, the development of the country rests with the government. says ways in which the government assists in development. Now, these are just a few ideas here, because obviously I didn't want to overcrowd the flow diagram. And these are some of the main topics that you should be looking at. So if we start, and we'll work clockwise around, the first one is that the government reduces taxes for investors in the country. So if developed nations from around the world want to invest in South Africa, the government then reduces the tariffs, the customs, and the amount of money that those countries must pay in order to invest in our country. And by doing that, it's going to increase South Africa's development. Secondly, attending international talks to encourage trade. They go to different countries and they say, right, this is what we can offer you. What are you going to offer us in terms of our trading agreement? Is it possible for us to have a very important trade agreement here? In the previous units, we looked at South Africa's major trading partner is China. The reason is South Africa had huge talks with China in order to come to that trading agreement. Building infrastructure. Countries cannot develop economically if there's no means of getting produce and that out of their country. So it is essential that their roads are in good condition. Harbors, so that the exports can leave via ships, which is one of the cheapest forms of transportation. Building of airports, so that there's a link to the rest of the world. That all lies within the government's responsibility to increase development. The government is also responsible to ensure that we have ongoing education to obtain an educated and a trained workforce. Development cannot happen if the majority of your workforce remains unskilled. You have to have people becoming more and more skilled in order for those goods to become more and more valuable. And lastly, the government needs to maintain a stable currency. Okay? If they cannot do that, no one wants to really invest within South Africa because the currency then is not worthwhile to their means. So those are just a few ideas on the ways in which the government can help in terms of supporting development. All right. We also can look at three different types or three different ways in which the government can support development. And one of the first ways that we look at is what's referred to as central state control. Okay, and just by looking at that heading, you should see central, okay, so they're at the center of things and they have state control over everything. It says central government, provinces and other state departments initiate development projects. Very important, the projects initiated by the government are very large scale projects. Okay, they're not going to just do some small little thing on the side, they're going to go big. They are long term, so that they see these projects lasting for a long period of time. Long term is like 20 to 30 years. They require large sums of money, and those large sums of money either have to come from the government, they have to come from investors from around the world, somewhere, but these projects need a large financing behind them. A current example, and this is within South Africa, is called the NGP, or what's called the New Growth Path. Okay, all very exciting. This is a state development policy for economic growth and equity. It plans to bring about development by creating jobs, reducing inequality that exists, and preventing poverty. So this is a plan that has been put in place by the South African government, and this is what it hopes to achieve. They haven't really laid out how they hope to achieve this, but they do have a plan in place. If we look at weak state control, okay, once again, just by looking at the name and the heading, weak, okay, means it's not really working so well. State control is weak. Government often fails to satisfy basic conditions, carry out its responsibilities of providing public services, trying to reduce widespread corruption and criminality. So in other words, weak state control, that government actually does not have a handle on the development in that country. Characteristics of weak state control: you've got an ineffective and weak government, okay, so they're not standing up for the rights of the people, they're just kind of doing their own thing, they're happy and they carry on with life. They have little control over their states. And lastly, it takes the country into a very sharp economic decline, which is a massive problem. Last one, okay, is called public or private partnerships. So this is the way in which companies are helping with the development of a country. The other two were ways in which the government would help with the development. In any market-based economy, state-owned, cooperative, and private enterprises must work together. State enterprises should be able to make more decisions with respect to pricing, production, and distribution of products and services. The private sector should be expanded through privatization, which is the transfer of ownership from the public to the private sector. This is believed to improve output, profits, and efficiency of the organization. So basically, how we can summarize the role of the public and the private partnerships is that the companies need to be given more power. Okay, and in that way, we can increase our outputs, increase the profits to the country, and the efficiency of all the organizations. All right, we need to now look at the role of aid in development. Okay, it's kind of like an additional section to this last and final topic, but it is quite an interesting idea as we look and discuss the different forms of aid that are given between countries. It says, in order to improve the standard of living, especially of developing countries, large sums of money are needed. International development aid is when the MEDCs, okay, so our more economically developed countries, help the less economically developed countries by giving loans, donations, and assistance where needed. The MEDCs are referred to as the donors because they grant the aid, and the LEDCs are referred to as the aid recipients. We looked at those definitions in our terminology section. Aid is used to develop economies, okay, and improve services so that we can better the quality of life for the population of developing nations. Aid can also be given with or without conditions. So when we look at the different types of aid, we're now going to see that these different conditions exist. Some countries might say, here's a whole bunch of money, we don't actually need anything from you, we just want to feel good, take our money. Other countries are like, here's our money, but give us all your mineral resources in return. So when we look at the different types of aid, we speak about bilateral aid, okay? One government giving to another government. That's essentially bilateral aid. The word bi implying two. Multilateral aid is from international organizations. So one country may receive different sources of aid from different organizations or different governments, and therefore they are receiving multilateral aid. Non-governmental organizations and private organizations such as the Red Cross would pass out aid to countries, especially when a disaster has struck that country. Private banks, okay, if they have enough money and they want to feel good, they can dish out loans as well as any direct investors. A lot of our multinational companies, it's part of their policy in that to invest in certain other countries and help generate the economy, provide jobs, that kind of an idea. Okay, so if we look at the types of developmental aid, and we're just going to pull it up so that the whole screen is viewed. We have three main types. We refer to technical aid, conditional aid, as well as humanitarian aid. Technical aid is technical solutions to social problems. So these would include project aid, program aid, donations, official development assistance. Official development assistance over here at the bottom could be building harbors, it could be building infrastructure, anything like that. Donations is obviously what the word explains. And under the conditional aid, usually with terms of repayment. So when conditional aid is given out, it's given with, well, we're going to lend you this money and you're going to pay it back to us at a huge interest rate. That can be in the form of bilateral, multilateral, grants from NGOs, loans, or direct investment. Lastly, humanitarian aid. Humanitarian aid is generally speaking issued when the country has been hit by disasters, or alternatively to a developing country who is suffering and needs a whole lot of support. Given to people in distress, not always development aid, but rather crisis or relief aid. Individual organizations or governments provide relief such as food, clothing, shelter, and donations. So, for example, when Haiti was hit by a hurricane, South Africa put together a whole humanitarian aid plane where they put on supplies and they flew to this island to go and try and help where they could because they had been destroyed by a hurricane. All right, we have advantages of aid and disadvantages of aid. So sometimes it can be a good thing, but other times it can be a bad thing. Let's look at the advantages first. All right, education and skills training can be improved with the addition of foreign investment in your country. So if you've been given money, the country can then focus on educating and training its people for development to take place. Secondly, a recipient country can receive a large sum of money to invest on the development of that country. So building infrastructure in terms of power stations, harbors and bridges, which is essential if your country wants to become an industrialized, more developed country. Many schools money can be used to improve the schools, the healthcare, and the basic needs of the people. Remember in mind, we are looking at the advantages. Developing countries benefit from the expertise, okay? So in other words, aid can be in the form of sending a skilled worker to a developing nation, whereby he can teach his expertise, show them modern technology, and try and develop the country by means of doing that. Other ideas, okay, development projects create jobs within the local economy, and that's always important, and therefore increases the economy of that country. Another advantage, I think we're at the end of our advantages. All right, so just bear in mind that aid can be a positive thing, but now we're going to look at the negative or the disadvantages of giving aid to certain countries. Right, with the disadvantages, governments, okay, receiving aid may have secret bank accounts. All right, because obviously a lot of politicians and that who are running developing countries are not the most honest people. And therefore, they can hide the money that they're given in terms of aid and use it for their private purposes later on in whatever they choose to. So that's a serious disadvantage because you're not directly giving the money to the people of the country. You're handing it over to the government, and the governments choose how to use it. Food often ends up by being sold privately. So when a country is having a famine and food in the or aid in the form of food is given to that country, then the government decides, well, we're actually going to sell it to the people and make money out of this, even though it's been given for free to their government from another government. Aid sometimes has conditions attached. All right, basically, countries may pass over aid to a certain country and say, well, we're going to need your government to do this for us. And those are the conditions that are attached to it. And if not, well, we're not giving you the money. Some governments in LEDCs manipulate their indicators of development, okay, to make them appear poorer than they are in order to receive extra aid payments. So they actually, instead of pretending to be or showing the country and the world that they're more developed, they actually hide those statistics and claim to be poorer than they are. Other disadvantages, aid is perceived as a handout rather than to assist in economic development. Debt repayments can outweigh the aid received. So a lot of the time when aid is given to a country, they get charged interest by paying back those loans, and it's to the disadvantage of that developing nation. Projects, okay, encouraged are often inappropriate to the needs of the people. So by building a harbour is not essentially going to impact the everyday social life and quality of life of an individual citizen within that country. And lastly, Products made in MEDCs from the LEDC's natural resources are sold back to them at higher prices. So like I said, a lot of developed countries go to the developing countries, take their raw materials from them and sell it back to them once they've processed and manufactured it. Those are just some advantages and disadvantages of aid. We're now going to go to a commercial break, and after the commercial break we're going to look at some questions on how you should answer them dealing with development issues as well as the role of aid in development. Welcome back after the ad break. You are watching Learn Extra Lessons, and our topic for the day has been development issues and challenges as well as the role of aid in development. We are now going to look at some questions and how to answer those questions based on the previous information we learned before the ad break. So if we look at the screen, question 1 says, a city wants to build a new airport. Write down the possible social and environmental impacts of a new airport. You should have a list of positive impacts and a list of negative impacts. So what they really want you to do, and I think you could choose either to write this as a paragraph question or alternatively just have a list of positive impacts and negative impacts associated with the development of a new airport. So let's go and look at some of the answers that we possibly could give in terms of this idea. Okay, so things that are positive about building a new airport in a particular city is, number one, grade 11s, we are going to have job creation. Job creation is essentially important in order for development to occur in a particular country. We are going to be able to increase our tourism to that country. By increasing tourism, we're going to increase the amount of foreign exchange coming into the country, once again beneficial to the economy. Thirdly, social upliftment. Okay, by building a new airport, we're going to have a lot of revenue generated from that airport. Jobs have been created, tourism coming in. We're going to be able to uplift our schools and our clinics based on additional money coming into the country. And lastly, we're going to be able to stimulate the local economy. Like we've spoken before in previous units, we speak about what's called the multiplier effect. So if we are to build a new airport in a particular area, that airport is going to require a certain amount of other services in addition to the function of that airport. So for example, you're going to have restaurants in the airport building. You will have a certain amount of shops in that airport building. Surrounding the airport, you might have car hire places. Okay, so for the people who coming off the aircrafts to hire a car, you're going to have the need for petrol stations. And this is what's meant by the multiplier effect, is that those activities grow purely from the building of one single entity, which is the building of the airport. Associated though with the building of the airport, we are also going to have a large amount of negative impacts as we build this airport. Things like natural vegetation and forest clearing. Depending on the location and the site of the airport, we are going to have to remove a certain amount of the natural environment. You're going to have to clear the land. Hopefully you're not clearing a land that has fertile soil in the area, and hopefully you're not going to have to clear and get rid of any trees that are adding extra oxygen and taking in carbon dioxide. Because as a result of our airport, we're going to have a lot of pollution from those aircrafts, and that's why the more vegetation we have, it's actually the better. We're going to disturb ecosystems. By disturbing our ecosystems, we're going to upset the natural balance in terms of food change and habitats for a lot of animals that live in and around that area. Airports are going to be extremely noisy. Certain creatures and that might not relate well to those kind of ideas. We're going to increase surface runoff and reduce infiltration. Now, we haven't really done a lot in grade 11 in terms of understanding what surface runoff and infiltration is, but when you study this in grade 12, pretty much in a nutshell, if we reduce our surface or increase our surface runoff, we're going to create flooding in a lot of our areas, and flooding is not such a good thing. By reducing the infiltration, our water table levels in that will also drop significantly because that water needs to seep through the level of the ground and into the water table. We've spoken about the noise pollution from those aircrafts, and that is why, generally speaking, one should build an airport far away from any residential areas. A lot of air pollution from the combustion engines of those airplanes, and fuel leaks and fire hazards go hand in hand with aircrafts as well, because they take on so many liters of petroleum. So as you can see, those are just some ideas. And obviously, please bear in mind, grade 11s, that if you come up with your own added idea, okay, as to how, or a positive impact or a negative impact as to the building of this airport, please feel free to write them down in your answers as well. You don't have to generally stick to the specifics. And memos a lot of the time also say accept any reasonable answer. So as long as your answer is reasonable and it makes sense and it is in line with the topic, please feel free to write it down. Okay, question 2. It says, global carbon emissions. What we've been given in our table that we're going to look at is we've been given about 8 different countries. We've been given the per capita emissions in metric tons of carbon dioxide, and we've been given the percent of world total emissions. Now, just a reminder, this word per capita, okay, means that the emissions have been divided by every person living within that country. So we're kind of looking at, you know, larger populations are possibly going to have higher per capita emissions. So if we go to question 1, it says, where do carbon emissions come from? What is the source of these carbon emissions, and why are they all of a sudden in our atmosphere? Firstly, the most important way in which carbon emissions are added to the atmosphere is through cars, okay? So when we use our motor vehicles, the exhaust gases, the fumes that are given off by the burning of the petrol, those cause carbon emissions into the atmosphere. Secondly, any airplanes, okay, are also going to release a whole bunch of carbon emissions into the Earth's atmosphere. Any factories or industries will create carbon emissions in the atmosphere. And these carbon emissions are actually not good, and our atmosphere cannot cope with this additional amount of carbon emissions that is being pumped into it from human activities on the Earth's surface. It then says in question 2.2, why are these carbon emissions a worldwide concern? Okay, so the key words here is worldwide. What influence is this carbon emissions having on the world as a whole sort of entity? And our biggest concern here is global warming, okay? Just as the name suggests, global warming is taking place across the entire globe, and global warming is happening as a result of the carbon emissions. So in speaking about why our carbon emissions are a worldwide concern is because we are creating global warming. And secondly, the global emissions, okay, are occurring across the world. So there is no one place that is exempt from putting carbon into the atmosphere. Every single country on the Earth's surface, in some or other way, is adding to the excess of carbon emissions in the world. And that is why these carbon emissions have become a worldwide concern. Okay, it then says, rank the top 5 countries in terms of the percent of the world total emissions, and rank the top 5 countries in terms of per capita emissions. So we have to go back to our table. Okay, and like I said, you've only been given 8 countries. So if we look for the top 5 in terms of per capita emissions, our top country would be the United States, followed by Canada, followed by Russia, followed by Germany, and lastly followed by Japan. So those would be the top 5 countries in terms of per capita emissions. It also told us to rank the top 5 countries in terms of total emissions into the world. And if we go back to our second column, we'll see it's China, the United States, Russia, India, and Japan. Okay, only 3 of the countries match or appear in both of the tables. So those 3, okay, so the United States, Russia, and Japan occur on both of the lists and within the top 5. The second half of the question says, suggest reasons for the differences in the 2 lists. In other words, why, for example, are those 3 countries located on both lists, and why is China, why is its per capita so low? Okay, it's got the highest total emissions of the world, but yet it's sitting with one of the smallest per capita readings. And the reason why is China, if you just look, okay, so we've got, let's just highlight China, okay, and India. Now, basically speaking, those countries both have enormous populations. And so even though their emissions are quite high, when you divide it by the population of those countries, because of the large populations, the emissions per capita are generally small. So it says, suggest reasons, and the most important reason is the large populations. So the larger your populations are, the smaller your per capita reading is going to be. Alternatively, you're also going to have a much higher percentage of emissions into the world as well. And I don't know if it's really fair, but if you consider that China is South Africa's biggest trading partner, and all our goods are coming from China, what kind of a role then does South Africa have in leading to China having the greatest percentage of world total emissions? And that's quite an interesting thing, because not only is South Africa one of China's biggest trading partners, a lot of other countries who do not appear on this table also have huge trading relationships with China. So they're at the top of the list in terms of global emissions, but they are producing goods for the entire rest of the world. So they look bad, but they're sending out the stuff. Okay, it then says, true or false? There is a strong link between a country's level of development and its carbon emissions. And the answer that they are looking for here is true. Okay? The more developed a country is, the higher or the more involved they are in industrial activities. So what you could say is it's true because developed countries, okay, equals industrialization. And when you have industrialization, you basically have the release of a lot of carbon emissions from those factories and industries within your country. Then says, what could you do to reduce your carbon footprint? Now remember, your carbon footprint is the impact that you are leaving on society and leaving on the environment by certain things that you do on a daily basis. So, for example, and these once again are just a few ideas. You can have your own ideas. Your textbooks might have some ideas. Use them, okay? They're not necessarily incorrect. To reduce our carbon footprint, we could use public transport. Okay? We could use alternative energy. All right? We could also buy locally produced food. Now, you might think, let's just finish, locally produced goods. You might think to yourself, well, how is buying locally produced food going to reduce my carbon footprint? Well, if you're constantly buying imported food, you then need to take, well, where has that imported food come from? It's been packaged in a company in another country. It's then got on an aircraft, okay? It's been flown to your country. And the ecological footprint attached to buying food that comes from another country is much higher than buying food that is produced in your own local community. So that's just a few ideas on how we can reduce our own carbon footprints around the world. All right, question 3. It says, Refer to the tables below showing who gives aid and who receives aid. Okay, so we're looking at donors and we're looking at recipients. It's a table showing who helps the world's developing countries and another table showing you who receives aid. And within this table, okay, we just need to point out a few things before we look at the questions. We have been given a list of the donor countries. We've been given a list of the aid granted in billions of US dollars. Another interesting addition in this table is this section over here where it says aid granted as a percentage of the GNI. And what hasn't been included throughout the explanation, which we can look at now, is that the United Nations has stipulated that all developed countries should give 0.7% or more of their GNI per year in the form of aid to developing countries. So that is why that specific table or that specific indicator has been added to this table. You can also see we have been given the HDI of the 5 countries of who is giving aid. And what we can tell straight away from those HDI values is that these are all developed countries. Okay, so it's essentially the developed countries that are giving the aid to the recipient countries. If we look at the second table, okay, they give you a list of countries, they give the amount of aid received because these are the recipient countries, and they give you the HDI of those recipient countries. And based on the HDI readings, okay, you can see that these are developing nations, purely based on that HDI reading. So this is what you should be doing when you start a test or an exam. Look at the information that they've given you in the table and write little notes and keys to yourself on those diagrams as to what the information is trying to show you before you look at the questions. So if we look at our first question, it says, look at the countries listed in the top 5 foreign aid donors. So donors, they are giving the money to the developing countries. Are they north or south of the brunt line? If we go back to where we said, oh, well, we know through the HDI reading that all these countries are developed, it should make the answer to 3.1 nice and easy, because all developed countries are found north of the brunt line. Okay, they're not going to be lying south of it. 3.2. Look at the countries that are listed as the aid recipients. So these are my developing countries. Are they north or south? Same thing. We discussed that the HDI of those countries indicated that they are very developing nations, and because they're developing, they are going to be south of the brunt line. So those are quite simple questions, although they may seem complicated at first. 3.3 says, explain the geographical significance of your answers to question 1 and 2 above. So if you look at 1 and 2 above, you've said that the donor countries are my developed countries who are lying north of the brunt line. My recipient countries are my poorer LEDCs who are lying south of the brunt line. What we try and get the geographical significance of this is that the developed countries, okay, right, are or always going to be our donor countries, and our developing countries will always be our recipients. Okay, why is that? It's because the donor countries have more money. And that's essentially what that question boils down to, is that you are not going to be getting money from developing countries that is given to the developed nations. 3.4 says, Which donor countries in the table have achieved the United Nations requirement that countries donate 0.7% of their GNI to aid? So this is where I spoke to you earlier about the requirement of the United Nations, okay? The United Nations have stipulated that if your country is developed, you should be passing over 0.7% of your total GNI. And if we go back to our table, and we look at that special heading, okay, the United States of America is only passing over 0.2% of their entire GNI in terms of aid and development around the world, okay? They're one of the highest or biggest grossing industries in terms of exports and imports, and they are only passing over a very small percentage. The United Kingdom and France are sitting at about 0.5%, okay? So only 2% off the required goal. But if we look, Netherlands and Sweden are donating the right amount of aid that is stipulated by the United Nations. Okay, so this answer is Netherlands and Sweden. All right, moving on. Look at the HDI of the aid donors and recipient countries. What trends do you notice? Okay, so it's a very simple one. We've kind of answered it previously. Basically, the donors have high HDI scores. Okay, and therefore, sorry, the 3 dots means therefore, they are the developed MEDCs. Okay, if we go back to the table and we look at all those countries, they're all sitting with HDI scores that are above 0.08, which in terms of development is extremely high. Coming back, all right, the recipients have low HDIs, and therefore they are the developing LEDCs. Okay, and if you go back just to confirm that, the HDIs, although Vietnam's is slightly higher than one would expect, it's still a developing country that relies on aid that is given to it. All right, moving on to question 4. Okay, question 4 is quite a nice, simple one. It would probably be considered one of the easier, more sort of direct questions. Okay, it says match each statement below with the type of aid in the box. So it gives you the different types of aid that exist. And if we just look at those briefly, okay, conditional aid, that is aid that is given from one country to another with certain conditions attached to it. So I will give you money, but I want to take your resources. Multilateral aid is where aid is received from a multiple variety of different institutions or governments. Humanitarian aid is aid that is given in terms of relief and disaster-struck aid. Technical aid, okay, is where they go into a country and they say, right, we're going to build you a bridge, or we're going to build you a harbor, we're going to help you with skills training for your population. NGO aid, which is non-governmental organizational aid, okay, is given in terms of providing medicines, maybe providing stationery, books, that kind of stuff. And bilateral aid is when 2 countries are involved. Okay, so if we look at the statements below, it says Sweden grants financial aid to Lesotho with no conditions. And if we go back to our table, it's therefore not conditional aid. It cannot be multinational aid or multilateral aid because it's only involving 2 countries. It's not humanitarian aid. Technical aid, that is the one, technical aid means that they're building a harbor or an institution. It's not from a non-governmental organization, and therefore the only possible answer to this is bilateral aid. Okay, it's aid taking place between 2 countries, no conditions are involved. The second question. The United Nations organization grants aid to South African farmers in rural areas. The United Nations is a non-governmental organization, okay? And very important, it says we need two answers here. So you should know already that we have got what's called NGO aid, okay? Because the United Nations is a non-governmental organization, and they are granting aid to South African farmers in rural areas. So what they're trying to do there, so we've used NGO aid, it's not conditional, okay, they're not going to get anything out of it. Humanitarian, it's not humanitarian, they're not causing, there hasn't been a disaster in South Africa. Technical aid, they're not building anything, and bilateral, so the only other option we can write down is multilateral aid. All right. The Red Cross assists flood victims in India. The Red Cross is a non-governmental organization. Okay, so it's going to be non-governmental organizational aid and probably humanitarian aid. So those are the two answers. Once again, it did specifically ask for two answers. Question 4.4. The South African public sends food and water to earthquake victims in Indonesia. That is so certainly going to be a form of humanitarian aid. They have suffered a natural disaster, and South Africa is not going to expect anything in return for its food and water from these people. 4.5, the Korean government assists Mozambique in building a large hydroelectric dam. That is a form of technical aid. All right, so in terms of that, basically speaking, they are assisting their country in building infrastructure in order to improve its development within the worldwide economies. 4.6, the Chinese government agrees to build a railway line in Angola in exchange for oil and gases. That, they want something. The word exchanges there is a form of conditional aid. Okay, so really speaking is that when you're given a question like this, you need to know what those specific types of aid are and then place them according to where you think they go within the bigger scheme of things. Okay, so those are just my types of aid. We have matched them. Maybe just go back and check that you have used all of the statements at least once, okay? And then obviously some of our questions did require you to put more than one answer into that. That brings us to the end of the question section in terms of development issues, challenges, and the role of aid. I hope you've enjoyed the questions, found them useful. Just make sure that you know exactly what's been asked in the questions. Focus your ideas on really where you want to go with your answers, and keep your definitions in mind, and make large summaries on this important development section.